Welcome back to a Slice of News, where I cut you off a slice of news. As the Department of Homeland Security continues to be shut down after a lack of funding last month, and sick calls among TSA agents increase, there's a concern U.S. airports may start having to be shut down entirely, according to TSA Administrator Adam Stahl. And the longer the department remains shut down, the worse things are going to get. 300 TSA agents have quit since funding ran out for the department back in February, and call-out rates for those who did show up to work have tripled over the course of this shutdown period, from around 2% before funding ran out to 6% average call-out since the money ran out 1 month ago. At one airport in Houston, 53% of the TSA officers called out on the 8th of March, and the next day, 47% did not show up. And major airports like New York's JFK have seen over 20% of their agents call out of work. All these call-outs and quittings have resulted in a bad time for travelers, many of them encountering multi-hour-long lines just to get to their gate. While the massive inconvenience to people just trying to get on their plane and get where they're going to is pretty massive, those workers, and I guess now former workers, who are having to go into work day in and day out for a month now without any pay. When you really get down to it, these are just people with expenses and families and cars that need gas who can't afford to literally have no money coming in for this extended period of time. The social contract is they have agreed to trade their time and labor for monetary compensation. So if they're continuing to provide that time and that labor, but not receiving the monetary compensation in return for it, they really don't have any reason to have to continue to provide it. Their need for money to be able to run their lives outside of work didn't end when department funding did. Honestly, I'm pretty surprised only around 300 agents have quit in the last month. If I had been having to work this long at that job for no money, I would think those numbers would be much higher by now. Reportedly, TSA agents who are remaining on the job have had to resort to sleeping in their cars and giving blood just to afford gas to get to work in those cars, just to get by on a daily basis. Under those sorts of dire conditions, I would be seriously questioning if I wanted to keep that job too. Especially because right now there's absolutely no way of predicting how long they would have to be going without pay from this point. Last week is when they missed their first full paycheck during the course of this department shutdown, and it really sounds like they can't possibly afford to miss a second. And the longer the department shutdown and lack of funding lasts, and the more stress it puts upon the now dwindling amount of TSA workers, the worse the effect on American air travelers is going to be. And considering we're getting into peak spring break time, right now is probably not the time for multi-hour long security lines, an additional inconvenience. The TSA workers aren't happy, prospective travelers aren't happy. It's a really bad time for everybody involved. It is, as Administrator Stahl called it, a serious situation. But like every situation, there is a solution. It's just a matter of finding it. One might think that's easy. If the problem is the money got turned off, just turn the money back on. Fund the Department of Homeland Security again. Fund TSA. Give these workers back their paychecks, and the stuff at the airport will just go back to normal. But of course, the things that seem overly simple rarely actually are. Democrats in Congress proposed the bill that would have funded TSA while not funding ICE, but congressional Republicans turned it down. They couldn't get their ICE money. They didn't want it. So while we could see the funding reinstated and these workers finally get paid again, we won't, because those who are in charge of getting that done only want to do it with conditions, and they can't agree on which conditions are acceptable to both sides. So the funding remains deadlocked and these workers remain unpaid. Some have suggested if the callouts are already at an all-time high, turn it up to 11. Just have massive callouts for TSAs across the nation and basically shut the system down entirely and force those in government to act immediately. It's a similar idea to what was discussed during the most recent complete government shutdown when it came to air traffic controllers. If these workers are going to have to keep coming into work for no pay, they're just not going to come into work at all. And if they do so en masse, they could potentially force action from those in Congress when it comes to the funding that they so desperately need right now. Whether they'd actually go through with it is another question entirely, but it does pose an interesting question. If those working for TSA did go through with it, what would happen? The air traffic controllers had gone on a massive strike during the government shutdown. There was talk that the government would simply temporarily replace them with military personnel to keep the planes in the air and at least avert a complete shutdown of air traffic during that period. And while military air traffic and domestic air traffic are two very different beasts, so it's not a one-to-one replacement, at the very least there was theoretically the possibility for that to be an option in the extreme short term. But if there was mass call-outs at TSA and a majority of the TSA workers simply did not show up for work, there isn't really a clear answer who would replace them, even temporarily. There isn't really like a backup TSA the way there was a sort of backup air traffic control. The possibility of full-on airport shutdowns were put forward because without TSA, there really isn't anyone. You take the TSA people out of the equation, people are just walking up to their gates and getting on the plane. There is no alternative to the TSA right now. And that's a fact the unpaid TSA workers could theoretically use to their advantage. They are the ones that hold the cards in that way, so the government would have no real leverage against them. When you really think about it, TSA agents can't be compelled to come into work if they're not being paid for it. The government can't pull a wimpy from Popeye and say, oh, I'll pay you at some indeterminate future date for work today. It doesn't feel like there's any good reason to trust this government to actually do so. And these people can't work on the honor system. Oh, if you work, we'll pay you eventually, probably. Obviously not. No pay means no work. Simple as that. So until Congress finds a way to pay them, these workers really shouldn't be having to work at all and should use that fact to their advantage and mass don't show up to work in protest. For some, this ongoing funding stalemate has actually got them wondering not how do we get money back to TSA, but do we actually need TSA at all anymore? TSA and actually the entire Department of Homeland Security was established barely 2.5 decades ago in response to the 9/11 attacks. Those people would argue that 9/11 was something that was absolutely terrible and awful, but also something that was singular, that could only really happen the one time, and the circumstances that allowed it to occur could not be replicated, and therefore this increase in security, including TSA, is largely overkill if it worked as advertised, but the reality is it doesn't, and TSA is largely just security theater, something that allows the average American to feel like they have the illusion of extreme safety and supreme security. The reality is that the pre-9/11 metal detectors and bag x-rays were actually plenty of security, and more than that, is more about looking extra secure than actually being extra secure. And the funds that go into perpetuating that so-called security theater would be better used elsewhere. It's admittedly a thought I've had on occasion, really looking at all the things TSA makes you do, not being able to bring liquids on the plane, only being able to bring the tiny toothpaste, taking off your shoes, going through the body scanner, and wondering, do we really need all this? Is it really accomplishing anything other than perpetuating a fantasy of extreme security and protection? I'd really say probably not. And if it weren't for the fact that eliminating TSA entirely, maybe even the entire Department of Homeland Security, would put a lot of people entirely out of work when we've seen just how bad things have gotten for them just from missing a single paycheck, I would really say go for it. In my eyes, stuff like Department of Homeland Security and TSA outlived this necessity long ago, if they ever really had one to begin with. I'd almost go as far as to say that the purpose of those departments were to keep the American people scared, in a state of fear, because they were basically saying, if it weren't for us, all these bad things would happen, so we are necessary to prevent them from occurring. And that had a great effect in a time right after the 9/11 attacks, when people were at their peak fear, understandably. But nearly 25 years later, we're not living in that state of fear and raw emotion. We don't need to continue the extreme post-9/11 precautions, and not doing so doesn't inherently make us less safe. Paradoxically, I think less visible extreme security would actually make some people feel more safe, because they would feel that that meant that there wasn't a heightened fear and necessity for it, and that things were actually already pretty safe, which they were pre 9/11. But as tempting as it is, I don't think an extreme move like eliminating Homeland Security and TSA entirely is the solution here. Eventually, maybe. But right now, the answer is probably congressional Republicans actually trying to find an agreement with congressional Democrats on a bill that would allow funding to be returned to the TSA and these workers to actually get paid again. But at a time where compromise is a dirty word for Republicans, and they are of the opinion that either they get everything they want or nobody gets anything, to say that that is easier said than done is a massive understatement. So as a result, how they get out of this at this moment is anyone's guess. But at the rate things are going, things are likely to get much worse before they get better, and massively long lines at airport security is probably the best case scenario, because I don't think anything's going to change anytime soon, and more TSA workers are going to call in sick or just never come back. And honestly, in their shoes, I'd probably do the same. Alright guys, that'll be it for this episode of A Slice of News. I've been your host, Mr. Slice. Until next time when I cut you off another slice of news. And don't forget to rate and review the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you find it.